This is the final part of the sneaker socks knit along. First we knitted the toe part of the sock, then we made the foot part, carefully shaped the heel, and now the sock looks almost finished. The only thing that's still missing is the cuff. And the task of this part of the knit along is to make that cuff and to bind off stitches using an elastic bind off. Because sneaker socks are low-cut socks, step 7 of the pattern, the step that explains how to make the cuff, is the shortest of all steps. It only has 7 words. Work in 1x1 ribbing for 4 rounds. And this number, 4 rounds, is the same for all sizes. So no matter what size you're making, simply knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch, and then go on and on and on to the end of the round and do it for 4 rounds. So 1x1 ribbing is pretty straightforward. So you will simply knit 1 stitch, then purl 1 stitch, then knit 1 stitch and purl 1 stitch. And then we go like that to the end of the round and we do it for 4 rounds. And that means that this part of the knit along starts with relaxed knitting and purling, and that's a good start before things get slightly more challenging. And here are the last stitches of the 4th round of the cuff, where I was knitting and purling, working in 1x1 rib for 4 rounds. If you lost track of the rounds, simply count the purls over here. Between any 2 knit stitches, count the purls and you should have 4 of them. So the 4th one would be right underneath the needle. That means that you worked 4 rounds, and make sure you stop at the beginning of the round. We still have that marker that helps us understand where the beginning of the round is. The cuff is done, and now it's time to move on to a more challenging part using the bind off that creates a lovely elastic edge that looks really nice. It doesn't have any ridge on it, and this is the bind off recommended in the pattern. It is called Italian bind off or tubular bind off, and it is perfect for binding off stitches of the toe-up socks, or pretty much any project that requires an elastic edge. And that's exactly what we're gonna do right now. This bind off requires 2 preparation rounds. The first preparation round is knit 1 stitch and then slip 1 stitch with the yarn in front of the work. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. So we knit 1 stitch, and then we bring the yarn to the front of the work and slip 1 stitch purlwise. See, I am inserting the tip of the right needle from right to left, and then leave the yarn at the front of the work, at the front of that stitch, and slip it from the left needle to the right needle. Then bring the yarn to the back and knit the next one. Yarn to the front, slip a stitch, yarn to the back, knit a stitch, yarn to the front, slip a stitch, and keep going until you get to the end of this round. Knit the last knit and slip the last purl. Make sure the yarn stays at the front of the work and that you don't lose that wrap. So move the yarn to the back and then hold it while you rearrange the work for working the next round. So see, I make sure that the yarn is still here so that I don't lose that wrap. That's important. Now rearrange the work for working on the next round, and the next preparation round will be slip 1 stitch with the yarn at the back of the work and then purl 1 stitch. So we'll be slipping the knits and purling the purls. If we look at the ribbing that we've done in the cuff, so we'll be slipping the knits with the yarn at the back of the work and then purling the purls. So insert the tip of the right needle from right to left into the first stitch, slip it with the yarn at the back of the work, and then bring the yarn to the front and purl the next stitch. Then yarn to the back, slip, yarn to the front, purl, slip, purl, and keep going until you get to the end of this round. slip and purl the last stitch, and we are done. So that was preparation round 2. Now we are ready to actually bind off stitches. Why we need these preparation rounds? They work really well with the bind off, and they make sure that the edge looks well finished and quite professional. So it's worth the effort to make these preparation rounds. And now we're gonna bind off stitches, we're gonna close them, and we'll do it with a wool needle. When I work with socks, I usually use this smaller wool needle, but any wool needle will do as long as it fits into the stitch, because some wool needles could be too big to fit into the stitch, so stay away from those for this project, okay? But before we use the wool needle, we need to cut the yarn, and we need to leave a tail that is at least 3 times as long as the bind off edge. So I'm gonna measure the yarn. So that's gonna be 1 round, then 2, then 3. And you know, I usually leave more yarn because with this bind off, so I'm gonna leave some more and cut the yarn, because with this bind off, it is better to have extra yarn than not enough yarn, because if you run out of yarn somewhere over here, for example, you don't have enough yarn to bind off these stitches, you will have to attach the yarn here, and then chances are that it will be visible, and you don't want anything ugly on this beautiful bind off edge that we're gonna make. So I usually leave extra yarn, and I highly recommend that you do too, because it's worth it. Now insert the yarn into the wool needle and let's get binding off. This is not an easy task, so I'm not saying that it is an easy bind off, but it is really worth a try. So if you've never done tubular bind off before, or Italian bind off as it's also called, give it a chance. Just give it a try and see how it goes, because that's a skill that's worth having in your knitting toolkit. So this bind off is not complicated either. It's just a set of steps that we'll have to do, and we'll start with the first step that is unfortunately the most awkward one. So don't worry, once you're past this step, it won't be that bad, okay? I promise. So the first step would be to get into the second stitch. So to get into the second stitch with the wool needle, we have to place it at the back of the first stitch. Simply place it here and then move it. See, this is my needle. I place it at the back of the stitch and then insert it from left to right, from that side, into the second stitch. So into that purl, just like this. See, you go. It's a bit awkward, but it's totally doable. So that's the beginning of the bind off. So we go into, let's do it again. Okay, I'll show you once again. So you go at the back of the first stitch, bring it through the wool needle, and then move the wool needle kind of this way so that it goes into the second stitch on the needle. And that's our first purl. And then pull the yarn through. Just like this. And now we're gonna join 2 knits. So we're gonna insert the wool needle from left to right into the first knit stitch, and then slip it off the needle. So no more awkward, twists and turns. And because we already have yarn in the second stitch, thanks to our awkward maneuver, right? We can slip that stitch off the needle as well. So now it feels easier, it feels more relaxed, right? We are not doing anything tight. And then we insert the wool needle from back to front, from right to left, into the next knit stitch. So we're going literally front to back into one stitch, into the one stitch, and out, back to front, into the next knit stitch. So slip that stitch off the needle as well, so you feel more relaxed, and pull the yarn. In this particular project, don't make this bind off tight. We already did 2 preparation rows and the rounds, and they're gonna serve well to keep the edge from stretching too much. So this bind off should be quite loose, because if you make it tight combined with the preparation rounds, you might feel, you know, uncomfortable putting the sock on, and we don't want that right now. After all we've been through with this sock, we want it to be comfortable. So make this, don't pull the yarn at this step, don't pull it too tight, so keep it kind of relaxed, not loopy, you know, but not tight as well. And now we're going to join two purl stitch. So the first one is over here, we slipped it, remember? So we go back to front into that stitch. Let me find it first. And that would be the stitch over here. So back to front into that stitch, and front to back or left to right if you're looking at the needle into the next stitch. So we're joining two purls. Slip the stitch off the needle, of the knitting needle, and pull the yarn through and form the edge so that it's not too tight but not too loose either. About like this. This is good. Now we're gonna join two. Oh, see, I have a knot over here. That's the side effect of being paranoid and leaving too much yarn, but I can live with that. I'd better have more yarn than I need for this bind off. So now we're gonna join these two knits again. So we go front to back into the knit that's already has the yarn in it. So we worked that knit already, that stitch. So we go front to back into that stitch, and then we go back to front or right to left if you're looking at the needle, into the next knit stitch. Slip that stitch off the needle, off the knitting needle, and pull the yarn and shape the top of the seam. And then we go then we join the purl stitches again. So we go back to front into the previous worked purl stitch that is right here, and then we go front to back or left to right into the next purl stitch. Slip this purl stitch off the needle and pull the yarn. And that's exactly what we're gonna do up until, see, I think this one is way too big, so I'm gonna pull it just a bit to make it all even, because you don't want one loop to be bigger than others, right? And that's exactly what we're gonna do. We're gonna join knits, two knits, into one stitch, out the next stitch, pull the yarn through, then form the edge at the top, and then we join the purls. If you don't see the purl from this side, then simply tilt the work a bit, and then you will see it as a knit over here. So you go in there and out the next stitch and pull the yarn through and shape the edge. Then again, a pair of knits, one knit stitch here, one knit stitch there, and a pair of purls. Tilt the work if that's the, I find it easier when I do it just on my own without knitting along with you, my friends. I simply tilt the work and I find it easier to see the stitches from this side better. So I go into that stitch and out the next stitch and pull the yarn through. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So we join knits to knits and purls to purls. That's the secret formula. And make sure the edge is not too tight. So keep going until you join all stitches and all the and have a lovely, oops, that's too much. We don't want to join toe part with the sock to the bind off, and have a lovely bind off edge. See, like this one. And this one doesn't really have a ridge like usual bind offs, so it looks very professional and very well finished. It is really nice way to bind off top of the toe up sock. So this sock is going to be a beauty. Knit to knit and purl to purl. That's the trick. This is my last pair of knit stitches. So I pull the yarn, and now we have just one stitch left, and we have to join it to the previous purl over here. And the needles are free, we put them aside, we don't need them anymore. And to close this gap, we need to join the last knit stitch and the first knit stitch, this one over here. The same way, we go into this stitch and out of this stitch. Pull the yarn through. And then we do the same with the last purls. The last purl over here, and we find the first purl, the one that we worked, remember when we did that awkward step? So we join these two stitches, shape nicely the edge, and we are done. See, there's no even no gap, no join, nothing that will tell you that something happened in this particular part of the work. And now the bind off is finished. Look at that bind off. It's really nice and stretchy, and it gives a lovely finished look, and it would look even better once you block the sock. So now, while we have the yarn on the needle, we would secure it. Simply make an extra stitch somewhere over here, and then go into that loop. And see, the yarn, as is true with any sewn bind off, the yarn tends to be twisted, so it doesn't like, the knitting yarn doesn't like sewing at all. It does not behave well usually, so it gets twisted. And if that's the case, simply let it hang and untwist on itself. So that's the simple trick, and then it won't be bothering you. And then after a few stitches that it will twist again, then do it again. So that's the only remedy. Make a stitch. I usually make a couple stitches to secure the yarn properly, to know that I won't have unraveled yarn over here. And while we have this yarn on the needle already, it makes sense to weave the tail. And I usually do it by going through several stitches and splitting the yarn. That's why I like this thin wool needle, because it allows me to split this thin yarn. And then go, if you're really careful or cautious, go a few steps back, again splitting the yarn, and this way you would know that the tail stays there safely and it won't get out of its hiding spot ever. And if the sock is woolen, then you shouldn't worry at all, because as soon as it is washed, even once, the tail will be kind of felted there, even though it's like superwash, and the yarn will behave nice when you wash it. Still, the tail will felt in and it won't get out of the hiding spot. So this is the lovely bind off that makes that nice, well finished edge. And before we can proudly put the sock on, we need to remove the marker. We don't need it anymore, right? And another thing we have to do is weave in all tails. So if we just hid the last tail, if you chose to weave in the tail that was created during the cast on, if you chose to weave it in while we were working on the toe part shaping, then there is nothing else to do. If you had any more tails inside, then simply turn the sock inside out, find those tails and hide them. That's basically all there is to it. I hope you like this bind off, and I hope you gave it a chance, at least tried to do it. I know it's not easy, it's not the simplest bind off out there, but it's worth a try for sure. But if you don't feel like adding this challenge, to a fairly challenging pattern, especially the sock, the heel shaping that we've been through, it's challenging enough. So if you don't feel like using this bind off to finish off your sock, there is another bind off, a much simpler one that I'm going to show you in a moment. An easy alternative to the Italian bind off would be to use a simple yarn over bind off. This type of bind off gives enough stretch to the edge but does not look as impeccable as the Italian bind off that we just made in a moment ago. But this type of bind off is much easier to do. It does not require wool needle. We're gonna work on the knitting needles, and we don't even make any preparation rounds or anything special at all. So here's how it works. First, work the first stitch. So by working, I mean we knit the stitches that look like knits, and we purl the stitches that look like pearls. So the first stitch over here is clearly a knit, so I'm gonna knit this stitch. Then make a yarn over and work the next stitch. Again, working means working the stitch the way it looks. And this is a purl, so I'm gonna purl it. Now insert the tip of the left needle into the yarn over and the stitch that is at the right side of the yarn over. So we're basically skipping this stitch. We are going into the next, under the next two strands, the yarn over and the stitch at the right side of it. And then we pass the yarn over plus the stitch over the stitch at the left side, over this one that we seemingly skipped, but the truth is we were just waiting to pass the other two strands over that stitch. That's it. Now we make another yarn over and knit the next stitch, and not knit but work. So in this case I'm knitting it because it's a knit, but normally you will be purling the pearls and knitting the knits. And then again we go into the yarn over and the stitch at the right side of it and pass these two strands over the other stitch. Yarn over, work the next stitch, and that's going to be a purl for me in this case, and then go under those two strands, pass them over, yarn over, knit, pass them over, and keep going until you get to the last stitch and you bind off all of the stitches and have just one stitch left, just like we do when we bind off stitches the usual way. So just this one has a yarn over to give the edge more elasticity. Yarn over, knit, pass it over, and then yarn over and purl and pass these two strands over, and here we go. So we have just one stitch left, and here's how this bind off looks. It's really nice, it's stretchy, not as sleek looking as the edge created by the Italian bind off, but still quite lovely. It has its own charm, right? Even though it does have the visible ridge, still it's not a bad thing at all. And as you see, it is much easier, so you don't have to use even a wool needle. Well, we have to use a wool needle in a moment when we finish off, but before I cut the yarn, before we go there, I cut the yarn, put the needles aside, and pass the yarn tail through this last loop. But we ended up with this gap, and we're gonna fix it with the wool needle. That's where we need this little friend wool needle. Thread the yarn into the wool needle, and now I insert the wool needle under both legs of the first bind off stitch, like this. See, on the edge of the bind off edge we find the first stitch and go under both legs of that stitch from front to back. Then pull the yarn, but don't pull tight, too tight. This strand should be about the same size as the regular strand in every stitch of the bind off edge, because we're gonna kind of conceal the gap, conceal this join. We're gonna make it look as if it is one of the chains of the bind off edge, and then insert the wool needle under the back strand, under the back leg of the last stitch we bound off, just like this, creating basically this V that we all recognize as the top of the bind off edge, right? And now we go to the wrong side of the work. Again, make a loop, then go through that loop to secure the yarn, and then as we have this tail on in the wool needle already, so we simply hide it by going under several strands and hopefully splitting the yarn, because it usually helps when we hide the tail. And then go under 2 strands into the other direction and simply trim the tail. So that's it. The sock is finished. We did a great job working through the toe part, and then we made the foot part, and now then we shaped the heel. That was the fun part, wasn't it? And then we worked we made the cuff and did the bind off. And no matter what bind off you decided to use, I hope you'll enjoy wearing these low-cut ankle socks that do not slip off the feet. Now that the sock is finished, it will be much easier to repeat all 9 steps of the pattern and knit another sock that will complete the pair. To get the sneaker socks pattern, follow the link in the description. Thank you for watching this video and have a wonderful week. I'll see you in the next tutorial.